Just recently, I came down with a pretty bad case of unemployment. While I was and still am certainly glad to no longer be working at a place that was causing me much unneeded physical and emotional stress, I also found myself with much more free time on my hands. In the days leading up to my termination, however, I decided to dust off my copy of Persona 5 for the PlayStation 4, which I had played for all of 45 minutes after picking it up a month prior, having spent the past few weeks listening to its battle theme on repeat, already having an admiration for turn-based RPGs thanks to my lifelong love of Pokemon, and having watched Super Butterbun's For Beginners video that was 40 freaking minutes long on repeat. And to say I was having difficulties putting it down would be a major understatement. So for the 2 weeks between losing my job and a trip to Austin for RTX, I was pretty much just playing Persona 5, and of that I have no regrets. Some of you may be wondering though, what the hell is this Persona thing you're droning on about? Well, Persona is a series of turn-based dungeon-crawling JRPGs crossed with a high school life simulator developed by Atlus. At least that's how the series is today. You see, Persona is actually a spin-off of Shin Megami Tensei, another series of JRPGs made by Atlus, which, as far as my research has shown me, tends to focus on order versus chaos dynamics and is also really difficult by design. The first 3 games in the Persona series, Persona 1, Persona 2, and Persona 2, were much closer to SMT in their tone, design, aesthetic, and structure as far as I can tell, whereas the life simulator aspects and more overtly anime style that the series is known for originated in Persona 3 for the PlayStation 2. Okay, you may also be thinking to yourself, that's sort of a condensed history, but what is the series about? Well, here's the thing. Similar to Final Fantasy, each numbered game in the series is pretty much its own entity, i.e. you don't have to play Persona 3 to understand Persona 4, with the only sort of exception seeming to be getting more out of Persona 2 if you played the first game. There are references to past games in the later games, sure, but nothing that is absolutely necessary to know to understand a later installment. There are, however, common themes and elements between the main entries in the series, with the most consistent aspects throughout the series being monsters given life by the collective human unconscious, with the 2 types being malevolent shadows and the titular personas, physical manifestations of one's true self, of which the user has tamed. During the dungeon crawling segments of the game, you'll usually be fighting shadows using the abilities of these personas, but in-universe, the use of them is mentally and spiritually taxing, meaning that theoretically, continued use of one's persona may lead to possible death by exhaustion. As for how characters are able to call on the help of their personas, it varies from game to game. For example, in Persona 4, before one can summon their persona, they have to have the courage to face their own shadow and accept their own personal dark sides, while in Persona 5 it's done by physically and bloodily tearing off the mask they metaphorically wear to appease society, thus throwing off said society's shackles and awakening to a spirit of rebellion. The only other concepts which are consistent in the series from Persona 3 onward are the linear timescale and social links. You see, the plot of these games takes place over a certain number of days with certain events happening on certain days. After school, you're able to perform 2 activities from hanging out with friends to studying to working a job. Those last 2 for the most part just net you a bit of money and help you raise your social stats, but hanging out with friends is necessary in order to level up their social links. In every game there's a man named Igor who appears to you with various attendants in a metaphysical place between your conscious and subconscious called the Velvet Room. He and his attendants are mechanically there to explain what personas are, allow players to fuse multiple personas into stronger personas, and to encourage the player to spend time with their friends lest they be a lonely bastard with the social stats of the Ubermensch. As one progresses in a character's social link, not only does that character open up more to you and you learn more about them as people, but if they're one of your party members, they can gain a new ability during combat, such as the ability to perform a follow-up attack, cure status ailments, or take a fatal blow for you. On top of that, when fusing a new persona whose arcana matches a particular social link, the new persona will get a boost in power relative to how far along you are in the corresponding social link. Just as well, when you just about max out a social link with a character of the opposite sex, you can enter a romantic relationship with them. It's purely a personal choice and it doesn't affect the game much if at all, but the tenacity with which some fans will defend their choice in waifu can be seen as a testament to how well written these characters are, something I'll touch on later. That's more or less where the similarities between modern Persona games end though. Each one of them has their own distinct tone, theme, aesthetic, and story, let alone characters and locations. At the time of writing this, I've only played through Persona 5 and I'm about 40 hours into Persona 4, so I can't speak with much authority on anything Persona 3 related, but of what I have played, I can say right now that while these games are mechanically very similar, with Persona 5 having a few extra bells and whistles such as guns and 2 more types of elemental magic, they're each presented very differently, with Persona 4 definitely having a warmer, more cheery aesthetic despite its admittedly dark undertones, and Persona 5 maintaining a stylishly rebellious attitude throughout while also keeping an underlying sense of foreboding and uneasiness. But what exactly was it that kept me playing into the wee hours of the morning without realizing it? Well, it's a combination of several factors, the most prominent probably being the game's linear timescale I mentioned earlier. You're only given a certain amount of time to complete story objectives and only so much time in a day to hang out with friends or work on your social stats, and days in between plot dates tend to only last for a few minutes of game time as a result. So I tell myself, let me just go hang out with Kanji and rank up his social link, and then after that I come home and now, oh look, I can work on Nanako's social link. Then the next day comes because I can't save after spending time with Nanako because she's at night, and oh, Chie wants to hang out after school! Well, I am about to max out her social link and I do want to get romantically involved with her, so let's do it. Oh, but then I get home and I can social link with Dojima, and because I can't save, the next day at school starts, and now I have to go through 30 minutes of plot because it's time for that, and oh look, it's 5 a.m. and I have work in 3 hours, 10 out of 10 would pass out from lack of sleep at work again. The linear timescale encourages players to just keep playing for a little longer, and then for a few more minutes after that, and it can honestly be pretty addicting. But if it weren't for the fact that most, if not all of these characters are so well written and relatable that they feel real, then I wouldn't really bother as much. While their personalities, backstories, and quirks are established pretty organically through the main stories, it's in the social links where they truly get fleshed out and given time to develop in a more meaningful way than in the main story, which, while still meaningful, is done in a way to get you on board with the character and their struggles in the first place before delving into why their problems began in the first place through their social links. For example, Persona 4's Kanji Tatsumi is initially portrayed as a tough guy whose attempts at appearing manly are merely his attempts at compensating for him being attracted to men. But as you go through his social link, he tells you that his overt attempts of appearing masculine are also partially motivated by being shunned by boys as a child for not liking manly things, and treated as an oddity and bullied by girls for taking interest in home ec and sewing, as well as taking his deceased father's last words as a statement that Kanji wasn't a real man because he wasn't strong. Not only that, but throughout the story itself, Kanji still struggles a bit with his sexuality, as exemplified by his defensiveness about the subject and his shadow's flamboyantly homosexual attitude. While Kanji does come to accept that his shadow was the real him, his sexuality ultimately becomes less of an important matter to him than his fear of rejection, and he ultimately resolves to try and have others understand who he is as a person. Kanji is not only an interesting character, but a complex and believably realistic teenager who is simply trying to find himself at a time in his life when people often truly find out who they really are. There's also Naoto Shirogane, also from Persona 4, whose character arc outside of their social link is probably even more interesting than the social link itself. In the story, Naoto is introduced as a young detective prince who is brought in to help the Inaba PD investigate the murders and disappearances, and when Naoto uses himself as bait to find out who the culprit is, his shadow reveals that Naoto is not actually male, but female. It's explained that Naoto was a talented detective from when she was young, following in her family's footsteps, but she was oftentimes looked down upon as a detective because of her gender. As such, she began presenting herself as a boy, partially thanks to her androgyny, in order to be taken more seriously by her critics, but even then those who worked with Naoto looked down on her because of her age. Her desire to be perceived as male in order to be taken seriously by her colleagues is exemplified by her shadow in her dungeon in the Midnight Channel, who plans to perform a body alteration process which can easily be read as being a sex change operation. Naoto does confront and accept her shadow, and afterwards stops pretending to be male. She wanted to be a man not because she felt as though she were really a boy trapped in a girl's body, but because she wanted to be taken seriously in a male-dominated field. In the year 2017, where the perception of LGBT peoples is still in a transitionary period between being ignored, accepted, and fought against by various groups, especially here in the US, it's refreshing to see characters like Kanji and Naoto take a look at the matter in a way that isn't pandering, patronizing, derogatory, or ambivalent. If anything, they convey a potent message that it's okay to be who you are, and that, more importantly, your sexuality or gender identity should not define you as a person, but rather are smaller, though still key, aspects of one's character. And for me personally, I adore Mikoto Nijima's confidant in Persona 5. It's by no means complex, and it doesn't really break any new ground, but I was easily able to relate to her. She's an honor student and student council president, has great expectations thrust upon her by the adults in her life, but those very adults see her as below them and use her for busy work, while her fellow students see her as somewhat stuck up and unapproachable. Mikoto was stuck between responsibility, expectation, and a lack of friends for most, if not all, of her life. She's spent so many times living up to others' expectations and studying that she has pathetic social skills and little experience despite her vast knowledge and intellect. When she does make a friend outside of the Phantom Thieves, she tries to protect her from her malicious boyfriend, only to have it mostly blow up in her face. While I can't say that my own experience in public school was exactly the same, I can certainly sympathize with her. For most of my school years, I didn't really have many friends, and as such, I had poor social skills. Some fans of Persona 5 may see Mikoto as being somewhat boring or plain, and they somewhat have a point in that Mikoto Mikoto is nowhere near as interesting as, say, Yosuke, Kawakami, or the previously discussed Kanji or Naoto, but her character still resonates with myself and many others who have been in similar situations as Mikoto, and that may be why she's so beloved by so many players, myself included. But I've gone on long enough about the characters and social links. The dungeon crawling and combat are also highly engaging and simple to pick up and play on a whim. Fights with mooks typically don't last too long, and bosses require some proper strategy in order to take them down, taking advantage of their weaknesses and playing to whatever patterns they may throw at you, and the turn-based combat allows the player to take as much time as they need to plan out their approach while in a fight. It can get really intense and sometimes frustrating when you realize that you may have to go back and grind for a bit to take on a boss at the end of a dungeon, but beating them always leaves me immensely satisfied and feeling like I just accomplished something major. These games feel rewarding as a result, and seeing the story move along even just a bit while also being ahead of the game's schedule feels like you actually are making progress, and you are. Not to mention that clearing a dungeon ahead of schedule leaves you with more time to just hang out with friends and such, which, as I've already pretty much covered, is easily the most addicting aspect of these games. Alright then, you may be saying, smiling a bit, I'm interested in trying the series out. Where should I start? Well, that's where things get a bit more subjective, as where one should really start is really dependent on one's taste. And seeing as how I only have experience with Personas 4 and 5, with only knowledge of the earlier titles under my belt, I can only go so far when it comes to recommending a starting point in this series. Firstly, it should be noted that the series is predominantly exclusive to the PlayStation brand. You can play most of the games on a PlayStation 3 with the exception of Persona 2 Innocent Sin, but I would personally recommend starting with one of the modern games from 3 onwards. But again, it's down to taste. Persona 3, as far as I can tell, seems to have a darker tone, somewhat more in line with its predecessors, with death being a major theme, what with Persona users shooting themselves in the head to summon their persona in order to symbolically show they aren't afraid to die, and the main group being comprised of characters trying to cope with the idea of death and pondering their own reasons for living. Persona 4 focuses on a group of students investigating people's mysterious disappearances and subsequent murders in connection with the mysterious Midnight Channel, where they fight shadows and face their true selves to unlock the personas they use to further progress with their investigation. Despite its dark undertones, it does have a pretty cheery and upbeat presentation and tone throughout, with a J-pop inspired soundtrack, vibrant colors, and positive vibes from the main cast. And then there's Persona 5, which is about a group of phantom thieves infiltrating the palaces of wicked people's hearts in order to steal their distorted desires, forcing them to confess their horrible crimes in a bid to reform the hypocritical and corrupt society that is modern-day Japan. In addition to it being the most recent game coming out for the PS3 and PS4 this past April in North America, Persona 5 is also possibly the most relevant game in the series when it comes to what Americans can get out of it. Without giving too much away, political corruption plays a big role in this game's story, and given the current political climate here in the States, I feel as though it resonates incredibly well here. The theme of rebellion and reformation is in full force here, and it's also incredibly stylish to boot. It's easy to get into, and it's engaging from the get-go thanks to its framing device, being the protagonist recounting everything you play during a police interrogation after having been caught during a heist. But don't take my personal recommendation as gospel. Try out whichever one seems the most intriguing to you. Just know that these games are long. My first playthrough of Persona 5 was about 82 hours long, whereas veterans of the series seem to have their first playthroughs of it being nearly double that. I'm 40 hours into Persona 4 right now, and I've still got a ways to go. If you're a stickler for only putting money down for a game if you're going to get your money's worth, say, about an hour per dollar spent, then you'll certainly get your money's worth with this series. Before I got really into Persona, I was sort of ambivalent about playing video games to some degree. While working on the backlog, I felt like I was often forcing myself to play a lot of games, and as a result I found myself doing it less and less in my free time, until ultimately, despite having footage of 3 more games recorded and scripts for their reviews drafted for the show, I just sort of stopped. Persona was what made me fall in love with the medium again, and also fall in love with role-playing games all over again. I'm a strong proponent of games needing engaging, solid, fun gameplay before having a great story, but Persona, if it hasn't smashed that rule of mine with an oversized mallet, is at least an exception. I love its gameplay, but I love the stories, characters, themes, and ideas even more. I can't recommend this series enough, and if you have no means of playing it, then at least give the Persona 4 anime a watch. I watched most of it before starting that particular game and liked it so much that I stopped watching 8 episodes early so I could play the game and experience the ending for myself. There's also a series of anime movies based on Persona 3 that's apparently pretty good too, and Persona 5 is getting an anime next year on top of the Daybreakers OVA that's already out on Crunchyroll. If you're not into anime, well, I'm not a big anime person either, but I still managed to get really into this series despite my own personal ambivalence. Bottom line, play Persona. And if you're already a fan of the series, let me know in the comments which game is your favorite, who your favorite characters are, favorite personas, hell, even who your favorite waifu is. Let's get a discussion going. Thanks for sticking with me through this episode. I know it's long compared to other second opinions, but I just had a lot to say and didn't really want to cut this into multiple parts. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.